John's confusing. I was going to say that right off the bat. Anybody else a little confused on that one? John has like all this cryptic, mysterious, spiritualized language that's really hard to understand. So if you don't understand what John's talking about, you're not alone. It's a little bit complicated to dive into everything because he's speaking on so many different levels. It's a very deep passage, and it's very nuanced with a lot of things in it. And it's John is beautiful that way because it's very mystical, very contemplative, very spiritual. Whereas Mark, he's pretty practical. He's just like, hey, here's the way it is. This is what happened. Let me tell you. Let me show you how it did. John is a little bit different. His conversations are a little bit more mystical, spiritual, and harder to understand. So if you've ever read John and you're like, yep, don't know what's going on, you're not alone. There's plenty of people that feel that. Now, spring is upon us. Tomorrow is the spring equinox, which I am totally excited about. I am here for that. I am all done with winter. I don't know if any of y'all are all done with winter, but I'm all done with winter. Anybody else all done with winter? Or officially all done with winter tomorrow. It's going to be springtime. Now, Mother Nature might have different things to say about that than the calendar, but I'm all done. It means that we're like heading towards nicer weather. And maybe you've seen some things popping around your house. Maybe the tulips, maybe the daffodils, the crocuses, and other flowers that I don't know about. There's lots of those early spring ones. Last year, we intentionally bought like bulbs to plant in the ground, and we were waiting, like this spring is gonna be a lot more colorful than last spring because we planted lots of bulbs right in November. And there were tulip bulbs and crocus bulbs, and you know, the lilies are starting to pop out too. But there's always that like random sunflower in the middle of nowhere. Anybody else get that? And I didn't know what was going on. It turns out that's the birds. The birds, yeah, I'm learning this stuff. Y'all are nodding like, you should have known this, city boy. I grew up in Detroit, so I'm still learning some things about the country. I'm getting there. I'm getting there, but I grew up on 8 Mile and Grand River. We didn't do a lot of, you know, there wasn't a lot of farmland and everything. We had to drive to farmland. We had to drive to see a lake. Everything was a grid, you know, 1 mile grids with a grid of neighborhoods in the middle of it. That's where I grew up. So I didn't naturally have this country life that some of y'all have had growing up around here. And, you know, one of these years, we love feeding the birds, and there's all of these, like, random flowers growing up. I said, we did not plant this. We did not plant that. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, the birds are the ones who are doing this. The birds are the ones who are getting in there and planting things. And, you know, those seeds, even sometimes a bird will eat the seed, and it's not digestible, and then it comes out the other end, and it's planted. It's like a miracle. I don't know how they do that. But it happens. They're like miraculous, like little farmers. They're like planting things all over the place. But one of the things that I have noticed when you plant something in the ground, it's like, oh, that seed that the bird really valued, the seed that the bird like was fighting that other bird over, you know, falls to the ground, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's lost, it's gone, it's dead. No, it's not. It's planted. It has planted in the ground, and some things are going to come up later this year because of it. And there's always that like random sunflower. Some of those wild bird seed things, they don't flower. Some of those are just like, that's just a random weird looking thing. No flowers on that thing. But those like sunflowers that pop up, those are cool. I really like those. And then they have more sunflower seeds that come. So you've seen like those sunflower farms, the really big ones. Does anyone grow the really big ones? The ones that get like 300 feet tall, and you know, like then when the seeds get all heavy, the head bows down like this, and then all the seeds start falling out. Man, those are huge. It's like its head gets bowed and all the seeds start falling down. That's when you know it's like ready to harvest. But that head, sunflower head full of seeds, came from just one. That's how it works. That's how farmers have always done it. Until recent years where, you know, there's patents on certain kinds of seeds and all that kind of stuff that you're not allowed to save your seed for the next time. But for generations and generations, farmers would grow things. They'd harvest enough to, you know, make their harvest, but then they'd keep some so that they had something to plant next year. That's how generations and generations have farmed, because they know, well, if I eat all of this, if I harvest all of this, if I sell all of this, I don't have enough for later. I'm going to have to save a portion aside, and so I can plant it in the ground. And so this agricultural mindset is really steeped in this. In Jesus' day, everybody's a farmer. Because are you going to go to Walmart? You're going to stop by McDonald's? They don't do that, right? They're growing their own food. Most people have to grow their own food and buy specialty things from the market. But for the most part, it's just like your grandma was doing. Growing in cans. Well, they didn't have cans back then. But they were growing and like drying and preserving and keeping that food. And that's how they stayed alive, was farming. So like 94% of the people are going to be farmers of some fashion. So when Jesus uses a lot of agricultural terms, feels a little bit dated to us because I think we have one farmer in the house here. Right over here, Phil. Like we have one farmer in the house. But back in the day, like everybody in this room would have been farmers except two. And you would have been in politics. That's how it would have worked. So these people here know agricultural terms. They know what it is for a seed to fall to the ground and bury it in the ground. They know that if they have all the seeds, that if they eat them all, if they harvest them all and then eat them all, they have nothing for next year. They know these understandings of like the cycle of life and death, the cycle of growth and harvest, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the stars, the cycle of the planets. They are so in tune, like we keep in tune with time with our phones, right? This guy here, hi Facebook peoples. Like this phone keeps me in tune. We have a calendar that is, January all the way to December. And then we have to add, a leap day every now and then because when we go around the sun, we need to, every 4 years, we got to add one more day to keep up with, how the sun actually moves. They didn't have any of this stuff. They told time by the sun and the moon and the stars and the seasons, and they were very tied to the land. And so Jesus uses a lot of agricultural terms because these are agricultural people. They're tied to the land and they know the seasons. And so Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples for his coming death. I know it's like we're early in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, and he's like talking about this. But the weird thing about John is the first 3 years of Jesus' ministry is chapters 1 through 12. And then chapter 13 through the end of 22, I believe, is all the last week. And so keeping that in mind, he is starting here. This is the start of Holy Week for him. He's already done the triumphal entry where he's walked into Jerusalem and he's declared himself king, which was a very hot topic thing to do. He just walked right into the main city during the main festival, into the temple, and was like, hey, yep, I'm the king. And he's cleared the temple out, thrown all the money changers out. He's done some pretty dramatic things. He said some dramatic things throughout his ministry that's kind of got some people on his wrong side. They're like, we don't know about this Jesus guy. He does not fall into line very well. He does not tote the party line very well. He is definitely a naysayer when it comes to like positions of power and things. And so he has done all these things that made people angry, and now the last week he's going to really like amp that stuff up. And so he's preparing his disciples for his coming death that is just 6 days away from this moment. That's it. He's got 6 days to prepare his disciples. So that's the context of this verse. That's why he's telling this story to his disciples. It's like he's been their teacher. He's been their mentor. He's been their friend, like a father figure to some of them for the last 3 years. And now he's going to die. And he's trying to get his disciples to understand that this is a part of the process. They think that death is the end, and that death is the final, and death has the ultimate say. Because what happens if you speak out against Rome? Well, they know what happens when you speak out against Rome. They crucify you on a cross. That wasn't just the thing that they did to Jesus. They did that to anybody who spoke out against any criminal. Unless you owed a financial debt that you had an opportunity to make some money on things, then you'd be thrown into prison. Everyone else was crucified. If you were any kind of a criminal, That was the common way that they just dealt with you. They just killed you. So Jesus, they see this. They've been oppressed by Rome, by this crucifixion. When they try to rise up and fight back, Rome comes in, big armies come down, they squash it, and then they'll crucify an entire town. There was a time there was a city named Sepphoris, back when Jesus was about 3 to 5 years old. And they did an uprising against the Roman government. And Rome sent all these people in, and they burned the town to the ground, leveled it, burned it to the ground, and crucified everyone. It was thousands of people, and they did it all along the road to Sepphoris. And so then they had to hire all these people to come back and rebuild the city. And so Jesus, with his dad, who was a carpenter or a mason, would have had to walk this road back and forth. So Jesus would have seen thousands of people. Everyone would have just seen it, just hanging there. People hanging there, thousands of people on the road. This is the message they send to people. Don't get out of line, or this happens to you. That's what crucifixion was. Super common, very oppressive, and the people are sick of the Romans, and so they're getting all feisty again. Passover's there. The city has grown from 50,000 people to about 750,000 people. They outnumber the Romans in the area. They're like, what better time to have the Messiah come, claim the king, claim the throne, clear that temple out, and then rally everyone together to go and defeat Rome, just like Moses did with Egypt. It'll be great. We'll do it again. They keep waiting for that moment. And so Jesus does 2/3 of it. He walks in. This is what we talk about next week in Palm Sunday. He walks in, he claims the throne, he clears out the temple, and everyone's all like rooting for him, like, all right, this is the moment. Let's get our swords. Let's like kill the Romans. And Jesus instead allows himself to be arrested, allows himself to be crucified, and he dies. This is a crushing defeat for the disciples because this is their friend, their mentor, their father figure, their rabbi, their spiritual headship, like they're the person that they look to for help and teaching and hope and direction is now dead. Now what are we going to do? Jesus is trying to get some things through to them. And he says something interesting. He says, here's the verse here. Now among those who went to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and they said to him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Now remember, John is real mystical. He speaks on like multiple meanings at the same time. It's really confusing that way. But this whole thing of wanting to see Jesus, this is a repetitive thing that is in the Gospel of John. It's like, oh, come and see, is one of the phrases that John uses over and over again. And now we have these people. They are not the Jewish people, the people of God, the people of the Old Testament of our Bible. They were the official people of God, right? That's who was the people of God. And they had God as their God. And all the other people didn't have God as their God. They had other gods, and they were, weird like that. But the role of the people of God, the role of the Jewish people in this time, in that age, was to reveal God to the rest of the world. This is what God is like. So this phrase, the Greeks come out to see Jesus. That's weird. Like these Greeks are just kind of showing up, and they're like, we want to see your God. We want to see this Jesus figure that you got. This is really interesting. The people who are coming and desiring and seeking God now is not just tied to one ethnicity, but now we have all of these different cultures and nations and peoples coming and saying, we want to see what this is about. We want to see Jesus. And this is something that is kind of shocking for the early world, when now we know that the church is spread throughout the whole world and everything. Back then, it was all like your football team has their mascot. Like the people of God, they were like this football team, and their mascot was a guy called Yahweh. And then you had these people over here, the Greeks, and they had multiple mascots, but one of them was like Zeus. And so they had Zeus and Dionysius and all these different gods. So they were like mascots. Whose God's better? Whoever wins in war. That's whose God is better. That's how they decided these things. Is whoever could conquer another person with war and violence was the dominant one. And their God was stronger. It's like the playground mentality. My dad can beat up your dad. Like it's my God can beat up your God. Lots of stories in the Old Testament are written through that lens, looking at that way. But the role of the people of God It's always been to reveal God to the nations. This is what God is like. But they didn't ultimately know what that looked like until the person of Jesus shows up and says, this is what God is like. And so how do we see God? How can we see God? That's what this passage is addressing. This passage is like, we want to see Jesus. Okay, how do we do this? How do we see Jesus in our day and age? The role of the people of God, that's the Israelites back in the day, was to reveal God to the world. Guess what? We're the people of God. And that is our role, to show people what God is actually like. So your understanding of who God is actually really important. Because if you understand God to be like a petty and mean and retributive and like a whip-bearing, and I'm going to punish you, and now it's like, oh, you messed up. I've been waiting for this moment my whole life, and now I'm going to squash you. If that's your understanding of God, then you're going to reveal that God to the world. But that's not really what God is like. There's plenty of people doing that. There's plenty of people who say, oh, I believe God is this way, and I will show you what that's like. And so then it sets up these places of power where it's they call it high control religion. And now there's a big branch of psychology now dedicated to recovering religious trauma. And that's this understanding of God right there, is that God is this angry, punitive, ready to strike at any moment kind of a God. And then when that God is revealed to the world, it causes a lot of hurt and suffering and pain and trauma. And now we have an entire branch of psychology dedicated to helping people get better from that. But God isn't like that. That's not the God that we are to reveal to the world. That isn't what God is like. What God is like is what we see on Good Friday. This God that we believe has all power, like was able to create the entire universe, is hung on a cross and went there in love, by love, for love. This weakness of God hanging on a cross, helpless, can't come down, people mocking and cursing. And this is the nature of God. Not that the nature of God is to suffer with. The nature of God is to come alongside and then to help us overcome. To come alongside of us in our lives and not be a God outside of our circumstances. Have you ever been like, God, why are you not stepping in and doing something about this? Obviously, you have all power and you're all love, so then why aren't you doing something? Right? But does God have all power? Can God make a rock too big that he can't lift it up? See, the paradox is when we make God into a being that has absolute power to do anything, all of a sudden you got to qualify that with all these little statements of like, well, yeah, but he can't like do evil. Or God couldn't like not exist. And God can't, there's all these things that God can't do. And one of the things that God can't do is override you. God cannot override your decisions and make you into a robot and make you do what God wishes that you would do. And so when evil is done by someone to you, and then you're like, why, God? Why did you allow this to happen? You ever think those thoughts? Why did you allow this to happen? Or why did you do this? Why did you let this happen? God doesn't let things happen. God doesn't allow things to happen. Things happen in this world. And God indwells with us and walks through the things with us. And so this God on the cross is actually a revelation of the character and nature of God. God is love. John will write that later in an epistle to the Ephesian church called 1 John. He will say, God is love. And then there is a period after that. There's no, but you also got to remember there's wrath and there's judgment. And no, he didn't say that. God is love, and then there's a period. That's what God is. God is love. And that type of love that God is the most powerful force in the universe. Because it overcomes evil. Love overcomes evil. And Jesus is displaying how this happens. In perfect ultimate love, he's not saying, all right, I'm going to walk into Jerusalem and we are just going to rally the people together and we'll utterly obliterate and destroy Rome, and then I'll set you guys up as like this big global superpower, and then we'll love the people. It doesn't work that way. Because if you use violence, hatred, manipulation, dominance to get to the place of power to then exercise love, that actually shaped you into the kind of person who's not going to use love when you get there. How you get something determines who you are when you have it. And so we can't use the forces and the powers of the world to get to places of positions so that we can then exercise love later. Love is the way. Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Which means that we have to do it the way of Christ, which is the way of love. And that love was so dramatic that it took Christ straight to the cross. And he hangs on a cross, not because you're so awful, but because we don't have faith in love. You think about that? Someone says love is the way, and you're like, yeah, but that's not practical. That doesn't actually work in the real life. Those are the pushbacks that we'll get. Well, what are you going to do in this scenario or this situation or such and such? What would you do then, right? It shows us that love, we believe, is like part of the answer, and then most of the other answer is going to be violence or getting our way or pushing up our will upon others. But love is the way. And Jesus shows us the extent. If you want to see what God is like, you look to Jesus hanging on the cross. God gives of God's self to the fullest extent. All the way. Doesn't hold anything back. And what happens is the power of love is revealed in this moment. We don't like the story of the crucifixion very much because it's like, ooh, that's kind of like, can we just jump to Easter? We just get to the happy part? We just jump over that part and get to the happy stuff. Well, to get to the Easter, you have to travel through the Good Friday moment. And the Good Friday moment, this is the revelation of both our unwillingness or uneasiness with love and God's absolute faith in love. This is the moment where Christ had to have full faith that God was going to redeem and resurrect and gives himself over to be crucified. And in that moment, he did love absolutely perfectly. But what else is happening in that moment is there is a revelation of our desire for wrath and judgment and retribution and revenge and violence. Humans just have that built in. And when I say humans, I'm not talking about you and you and you and you. I'm just talking about us globally. You just watch the news and you see it. Right? You turn on any news, there's war over here, there's violence over here, there's greed over here, there's oppression over here. It's because we don't actually believe in love. It's hard to believe and have faith in love, but God is love. And that type of love is so powerful that it overcomes death. That type of love is the solution to hatred. You cannot heal hatred with hatred. You cannot heal violence with violence. The only way to do it is with love. Sometimes love is fierce, as we sang earlier. Sometimes love is going to call you out. Sometimes love is going to tell you the truth. And the truth will set you free, but first it's going to make you awfully uncomfortable. Has anyone ever told you the truth and you're like, ooh, I don't like that. I do not like that. Like, you got broccoli in your teeth, or your zipper is down. Or, like, don't say that out loud. Right? Sometimes people who love you are like, this one time I was a teenager and I had really bad acne as a teenager. And I was trying this new face scrub and I didn't get this part off. It was like right here. I walked around with my friends, I'm gonna call them friends, the entire night with like noxema all over my face because I didn't get it all off. And we ended up at Blockbuster. We went out to a movie. We went out to eat. And everyone's like looking at me. And I'm like, boy, I'm popular tonight. And then it was just like, oh my gosh, guys. We went to Blockbuster. I'm checking out at Blockbuster. And the cashier, I don't know. He's like, you got white stuff all over your face. I was like, what? I do? And I did this. And I'm like, oh my gosh. How much is there? And then I looked at my friends. And I was like, you let me do that? I have this on my face all night? Why didn't you? Like, we didn't want to hurt your feelings. I'm like, oh, but now I feel like a doofus. walking around with eczema on my face all night. Right? Sometimes when people love you, they got to tell you something like that, and it's not comfortable. Like, oh, you mean I've been walking around with that on my face all night long? See, love sometimes is truth, and sometimes it is fierce, and sometimes it steps in and says, no, you can't cross this line. Love sets boundaries, but it doesn't violently retribute against another person. And this moment on the cross is when God's nature of love is revealed to the whole world. This is what God is like, willing to let himself on the line for the sake of love, so that when we look at the cross, we both see two things happening. The extent of God's love, but also the lack of faith that we have in love to get the job done. Because Jesus didn't go along with the party lines. He disrupted the economy, and he told people no, and he tried to get poor people free, and he spoke truth to power and did some things. Like, he was honest, and those people didn't like it. And so there's two things. Human collected evil is being revealed in that moment, where God wasn't, one, faithful enough because he was crucified for treason, and two, God wasn't holy enough because he was also crucified for blasphemy. Isn't that crazy? Like, religious people and political people got together and then crucified God because he wasn't faithful to the nation, and he was not holy enough. He broke all these rules over here that we have set up. God wasn't holy enough for us, so we killed him? That's just weird stuff, man. When you think about it. Blasphemy and treason. That's what God got crucified for. And those are the two things that work us up. I mean, doesn't it? Like, we get worked up politically and religiously. Either wherever you are. You think of politics, like, you can get worked up real fast. You think of religion, you get worked up real fast into an emotional frenzy. You're like, ah. It's like, yeah, they weren't that much different, really. So God wasn't holy enough, wasn't faithful enough, and so, boom. That moment there, God's love. And he looks down upon the people crucifying him and says, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. They can't see beyond the frenzy that they're in. They can't see the water that they're swimming inside of. They don't see what's going on here. They're just doing what's asked of them, and they're doing what they think is right, and they're doing, but no. And so this moment here on the cross is a revelation of God's love, and it's a revelation of our unfaithfulness to believe that love can do it. And this is the cool quote here. This one. Jesus himself has been glorified not in human splendor, but in the cross. This is St. John of the Cross. He was a Catholic monk back in the 1400s. And he wrote this. This is the moment where God's glory. Jesus, you know that language that Jesus is using? I'm going to be glorified, and I'm already glorified. And God the Father is speaking down, saying, you have been glorified, and I will do it again. Like, this whole moment of glory. We think of glory, and it's like Super Bowl, or like, big wins, or like, oh my gosh, yes, triumphal moments. And the glory of God is revealed in the crucifixion. That's weird. But this is where love is put on full display. God's nature is put on full display. So if you want to see God, do not look in the places of glory, but in the places of self-giving love. That's where God is found. That could be found in the walls of a church building, and it can be found out on the streets, out there. Wherever you find self-giving love, that is where you find God. But Jesus knows it's not all about death. It's not all about dying and the moment there, is horrible. But that moment, he talks about wheat. He says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. There's that sunflower seed thing. You plant one in the ground, you get, 100 that comes out later. So Jesus knows this. And it's not planted. The wheat isn't planted. The wheat falls. Did you notice this? I noticed that this week. I was reading it. I'm like, wait a second. It's not talking about specifically going out intentionally planting things in the ground. When a grain of wheat falls, this is accidental. This is just like it happens. the falling wheat. God is not orchestrating everything in your life. God is not making things happen in your life and then not making things other happen. Is like, well, must not have been God's will. Oh, that was God's will. This is good. And then you ever notice that? Like most of our prayers, we're just looking back on life and interpreting it through our theology. I noticed that, which is why I don't say a lot of wordy prayers anymore, because I don't understand it yet. I'm figuring this out. I stick to like Teresa of Avila prayers, but I noticed that most of my prayers, God, could you do this and this and this and this and make this happen? And then on the other side, it's like, okay, all this happened. Well, let me see. How did God move? Okay, well, this is how it happened. And we just put it all, piece it all together. I'm like, most of my prayers were actually just piecing together a story to match the theology I had about God in my head in the first place. So God isn't just making things happen or letting things happen or allowing things to happen in your life. Like, things just happen. And sometimes it's random, and sometimes it sucks. But things happen in this world. Hurricanes happen. Tornadoes happen. The people in Ohio just got, like, tornadoes came through. You ever notice that those conservative churches, when, like, disaster hits, they're like, oh, that was God's judgment. And then disaster hits their church, and they're like, oh, we're under attack. Same thing, different interpretation. Same event, different interpretation. God's judgment because it wasn't a church. Now it's, oh, we're under attack, so it was a church. So this falling wheat tells us that God is not up there like a puppet master pulling strings to make or not make things happen. God is indwelling in our lives and working with us to work out the salvation that God has given us. God is maximally power, is the most powerful being in the universe. But God doesn't have the ability to make everything happen like the grand puppet master. So God is not orchestrating. That's falling wheat. Because that gives us all these bad cliches and bad theology. And when something bad happens to you, people say things like, oh, well, it must have been God's will. Or they say things like, well, God will work all things together for the good of those who love him. And God will never give you more than you can handle. And all those things, right? Like saying that God gives you those things. So you go through a really tough time. Well, God will never give you more than you can handle. Well, that implies that God gave you that hard thing. He's like, you know what? There you go. Cancer. You're 42. You can handle it. That'll make you stronger. That's not how God works. God didn't dish out cancer to my friend. It just happened because we're in a world where cancer is. The grain of wheat falls to the ground. But also resurrection happens. There is death. There is sickness. There is suffering in this world. God does not orchestrate it and make it happen. It happens all on its own. But God is the one who resurrects. God is the one who practiced resurrection. Falling wheat tells us that death is as inevitable as gravity, but so is resurrection. We can get caught up in the negativity of that and say, oh, death is inevitable. Suffering is inevitable. You know what? Resurrection is inevitable. Have you ever gone through a tragedy and then on the other side you have a whole new way of looking at your life? You lost that job. You're on the other side of that job and you're like, well, lost the job. I don't know what I'm going to do now. And then all of a sudden you put your life back together with God's inspiration and help and strength in the moment. And then all of a sudden some different opportunity shows up at your door. Resurrection happened. It's like, never would have gone here. I never would have left that job. And I never would have gone here if I didn't go through the death-resurrection process. Death and resurrection is a process. See, life is not diminished by death. It is rescued, rearranged, and eternalized. John of the Cross said that too. Jesus made it so that death is not the final blow of humanity. And there's little deaths along the way to the great one. The death of a job, the death of a relationship, the death of a dream, the death of your health. Right? Those things happen, and you have to reorganize and rearrange your life. And in the process of reorganizing and rearranging your life, part of it becomes eternalized. And death is no longer the closed door, dead end that it was, but it's actually the doorway into more life. That's what Jesus did. And Jesus says this, that life is found by giving it away, not hoarding it for yourself. That's the thing he's trying to communicate to us. We can get so protective of our life, and we close our hands around our life and we protect it with everything we got. And I'm never letting go. I'm never letting go. And you know what? What can I give you if you have a hand that's tightly shut? Nothing. But if we open our hands and we allow life to pass through our hands, the good and the bad, we allow the resurrection, the death and resurrection process to come and flow through our life. And like each moment is then a practice of learning how to live, and learning how to die, and learning how to resurrect over and over and over again, so that by the time you get to the final one, you're like, oh yeah, I've done this before. Practiced this before. I've had to give up this and this and this. I've had to say goodbye to them and them and them. I have done this process before, and I have experienced resurrection. Giving up this physical body is just going to be another one of those. So all of life is just a practice for that final surrender over to God's love. In full faith, saying, I believe that God is love and that I am held fast and never let go. I believe that. The gate is narrow. It is too difficult for me to enter, being burdened as I am with whims and wants and ways. That's Meister Eckhart, mystic from the 15th century. So that open-handed living. Don't be so protective and fearful and anxious that you're not going to have a good life, to where your hands are closed and you don't experience life at all, because you're constantly waiting for something better to happen than what is happening now. Experience the life that is in this moment. It's here. It might not be easy, but there is life to be found in this moment. Always. Because God is found in this moment. Always. And so we can practice the life and the death and the resurrection process. That's what Lent is about. Psalm 51 is our benediction for this week. And it says this: He calls you to discern His time and season, the sempiternal season of His mercy. Lifts like the sun above your dark horizon. Expose your darkness, sing your misery. His light will judge, and judging heal your sin. Then bathe in sheer beauty as Allegri sounds out your penitence, and let Christ clean your soul once more, erasing every stain, washing you thoroughly. For He has seen what you confess and what you hide. Again, He mends your broken bones and makes for you a clean heart. Comes to comfort you again. Comes with His Holy Spirit to renew the Spirit in you, calling you to sing of all your loving God has done for you. Psalm 51, retold by Malcolm Guite.